Hey traders, welcome to entry number 2 of the pullback strategy. Now, entry number 2 is nearly identical to entry number 1 with a couple of major different qualifications. One of those being that for entry number 1, we were looking for this entry pattern, our advanced engulfing entry below the 50 EMA. We wanted to see that happen before the market even touched the 50 EMA for our entry number 1, whereas for entry number 2, we're actually waiting for the market to touch the 50 EMA before starting to look for this entry. So what we want to see during this entry, number 2, is same as before. We want to see the market trading below our 50 EMA. We want to see the market breaking into brand new lows while trading below that. We do still wait for that at least 2 candle pullback, but the difference here is that this 2 candle pullback or more must touch the 50 EMA. So that's one change in the rules. For rule number 3, we need this pullback to be all the way up to the 50 EMA and be at least 2 candles. Once we get here with that pullback, we can only see, this is another extra rule that we're adding to the entry number 2, we can only see 1 candle that closes above the 50 EMA. So let's go through those last 2 rules one more time really quickly because they are new rules to the strategy for entry reason number 2. For rule number 3, now we need not only a 2 candle pullback, but we need this pullback to come all the way up and touch the 50 EMA. And for our new rule number 4, we cannot see more than 1 candle close above the 50 EMA. If that happens, that is an invalid trade. Here, as you can see, this green candle is the only candle that closes above the 50 EMA. We don't have to have this close, but if we get more than 1 close above the 50 EMA for this bearish example, then that would invalidate this trading opportunity as an entry reason number 2. So at most, we can only have 1 close above the 50 EMA. We can have a situation where nothing but the wicks touch the 50 EMA, and that makes for a valid entry reason number 2. But we can only have 1 close above the 50 EMA. Then, after getting only 1 close above the 50 EMA, or after the market just touches that 50 EMA, that's when we start looking for that advanced engulfing entry we talked about in previous lessons, and this advanced engulfing entry must close back below the 50 EMA. So again, we're waiting for that advanced engulfing entry. As you can see here, we get our 1, 2, 3 advanced engulfing entry, but we need that entry to close back below the 50 EMA. Do we get that? Yes, we do. So what we have so far is a valid rule number 1. The market is below the 50. A valid rule number 2, we are breaking into new lows right here. A valid rule number 3, we have more than a 2 candle pullback up that does touch the 50 EMA. A valid number 4, we only have 1 candle that closes above that 50 EMA. And we have a valid rule number 5, this advanced engulfing pattern that closes back below our 50 EMA. The only rule we're missing now in order to make this into a valid trading opportunity is to make sure that our entry reason does not close below the bodies of our previous swing low. Do we get that? The answer, of course, is yes, making this a valid entry number 2 for the pullback strategy. Let's run through that really quickly one more time. Again, I know this might be repetitive, but I want to make sure you're grasping this strategy before continuing. We have a market below the 50. Boom, making new lows, getting that pullback that touches the 50 EMA with more than 2 candles pulling back. We have only 1 candle above the 50 EMA that makes a close above the 50 EMA. We get our advanced entry reason that closes back below the 50 EMA, and that entry reason does not close below the body of the previous swing low, making this a valid entry. And that's the rules for entry number 2. Make sure you go ahead and write those down. And these are the only 2 ways we're going to be entering the market based on the pullback strategy. And one of the major benefits of having 2 separate entry reasons is that if we were to have gotten, let's say, a entry reason right here, let's say that this was an engulfing candle that met the rules of our trading plan for entry reason number 1. Well, if this was an engulfing candle that met the entry reason number 1 criteria for the pullback strategy, and then we got stopped out, say right here, well, that would give us another opportunity. The entry number 2 gives us a secondary opportunity to hop on the trend and get involved for the move down. So that's one of the main ways we're going to be using this entry number 2 is after a loss for entry number 1. And after a loss for entry number 1, the only way we can get involved in the market before either creating new lower lows or breaking above the 50 EMA and going into a new uptrend is if we get this entry number 2. So if we end up getting a valid entry right here, let's assume this was a valid entry number 1. and then the market consolidates in through here, stops us out, but does not hit the 50 EMA, and then gives us another valid entry number 1 right here. We could not take that trade unless the market had touched the 50 EMA. That's the only way we can take 2 trades on the same pullback. So this entry number 2 allows us to take that second trade, but only after the market pushes up and touches the 50 EMA and meets the criteria for entry number 2. And of course, there will be scenarios like this where entry number 2 is the first entry we get right here, and that's the only way we had to get involved in the trade, which helped us with some trend continuation here out of the market. So now that we've went over the rules for a bearish entry number 2, we'll take a look at a bullish version of this entry number 2 on the pullback strategy, and then we'll be ready to dive into stops and targets for this strategy. Make sure to go ahead and pause the video and write all of these rules down so you can have them by your trading desk and you can check them off each time you'd like to enter the market based on entry number 2 of the pullback strategy. So here we have a bullish example of the pullback strategy entry number 2. Let's go ahead and mark off the rules. Do we have rule number 1 met? Is this market pushing above the 50 EMA? Of course, the answer to that is yes. We can check off rule number 1. Or is this market making new highs compared to the previous high? Right back here is the previous high. So yes, that's a valid rule number 2. Number 3, we're waiting on at least a 2 candle pullback that touches the 50 EMA. Do we get that? Yes, we do. We have multiple red candles in this pullback, not only 2, but more than 2, and we do touch the 50 EMA with this wick along with this wick. That's okay. We don't need a candle to close below here. As long as we touch the 50 EMA, then that's fine. This rule states that we can only have up to 1 candle close below the 50 EMA, but as long as we touch the 50 EMA, we're still a valid rule number 4. So we have met rule number 3 and number 4 simultaneously. Now what we're waiting on is the advanced engulfing entry that we've talked about. As you can see here, we have an engulfing pattern that is a swing low. That's one of the advanced engulfing entry patterns we discussed in the basic section of the course. So that's a valid rule number 5. We can check that off. Rule number 6, this engulfing pattern cannot close above the swing high back here. That rule is obviously met as well, making this a valid entry number 2 for the pullback strategy. Let's go over that one more time to make sure you're getting it very, very clearly. We have a market above the 50, pushing up into new highs, meeting rule number 2. Rule number 3 is at least a 2 candle pullback that touches the 50 EMA. We definitely get that. Rule number 4, we cannot have more than 1 candle close below the 50 EMA. We do not get any candles closing below the 50 EMA, so that's obviously a valid rule number 4. Rule number 5, we need this engulfing candle to be an advanced engulfing entry we discussed in earlier lessons, and we needed to close back above the 50 EMA. This candle does that and qualifies for rule number 5. Rule number 6, this candle cannot close above the previous bodies of the previous swing high. So with all of those rules met, this would be, again, a valid entry number 2. Now let's discuss a little more about this entry. As stated previously in the bearish entry we took a look at for entry number 2, we will normally be using this entry after a loss of entry number 1. See if you can spot that entry number 1 on the chart in front of you. So here we have an entry number 1. We have a market breaking into new highs. We have a 1, 2 candle pullback. We have an engulfing candle here that is a swing low, meeting our advanced engulfing entry rule. And this entry does not close above the previous swing high. So what that means is this right here, this candle is a valid entry number 1 for the pullback strategy. We would have placed a trade there, more than likely been stopped out right down here. And after being stopped out, the only way we can place another trade is if this market either touches the 50 EMA and then gives us this setup, or we could have placed a trade if the market would have broke into a new downtrend or broke into new highs above this previous high looking left. So that's another thing we need to pay attention to in the markets as we go forward. Again, the only way after a loss of entry number 1, this would be our loss of entry number 1. At that point, the only ways we can trade, we have 3 separate ways we can trade after a loss. One of those ways is we get stopped out, then the market breaks into new higher highs from our previous high, continuing in trend. If that's the case, we can place that next pullback entry number 1. The other way is by placing an entry number 2 based on the pullback strategy, waiting for this criteria to be met, touch of the 50 EMA, and all the criteria for entry number 2. That's a way we can place a trade after a loss on entry number 1. And the other way is if this market breaks down into a brand new trend. So that's exactly what we're looking for with entry number 2. And of course, we don't have to lose this first trade in order to find this entry. As we looked at in the bearish example, this could just be a pullback directly into the 50 EMA, and that would be valid as well. So that's all the rules and criteria you need to understand in order to place entries based on the pullback strategy. In the next video lesson, we'll be talking about how to place stops and targets, which is extremely simple, and then we'll be ready to go ahead and dive into doing some back testing. We'll take a look at how to back test correctly, and then I'll actually start back testing a couple of these pairs with you guys to help you through that process. So I'll see you guys in the next lesson.